Welcome back, all. We are the Brothers Mahoney. This is Michael,
And I am James.
and today we're discussing sort of an interesting addition to the Doctor Who universe, a comic strip called The Nightwalkers.
The Nightwalkers, if you're unaware, and this is pretty obscure, so it's very possible that you are, is a comic strip published in TV Comic. TV Comic started, it's a British weekly comic, was a British weekly comic. It started in 1951, but of course, Doctor Who did it starting to 1963. But as early as November 1964, TV Comic had started publishing, Doctor Who comic strips. They did it, again, they were a weekly comic book thing. So it was probably around, maybe a story would be 2 pages, maybe it would be 4. I think most of them were just 2 pages, and they were black and white. And the very first one, starring the first Doctor and 2 other grandchildren, John and Gillian, is the Clapton Parasites. And so from 1964 until 1974 or so, when they lost the rights, maybe it's more around 75, when they lost the rights to, I believe it was Marvel in the UK. Maybe it was even later than 75. Point is, though, they lost the rights and they had to stop publishing Doctor Who stuff. But between all that time, in the main series, in a spin-off series called TV Countdown, or Countdown Action, they had multiple names, from different holiday specials, they printed Doctor Who stories. And they did it with regularity. As I said, the early ones for the first Doctor, and even some second Doctor ones, had the grandchildren John and Gillian. But by the time of the Nightwalkers, they had included Jamie in some of these stories, although Jamie does not appear in this one. Does he, Michael?
Now, this is published during an interesting time in the Doctor's history. He has no companion here, he is just on Earth in exile. This story, on a side note, was published in TV Comic issues 934 through 936. Naturally, it was published in 3 parts, and like James said, there's 2 pages apiece. And it was published in November 1969, so the tail end of the 1960s.
This story, and so many others of the TV comic era, was written by Roger Noel Cook, who, in a strange happenstance, actually apparently either passed away this month or was reported to have passed away this month at the very least, because I saw an article from, I think, the 14th, just 8 days ago, with an obituary for this person.
And if possible, we'll probably link the article in the description to this video.
Yeah, that would be very fair. But he wrote a lot of these TV comic strips, and also this was penciled by John Canning, who no confirmation is really known. There was another article, funnily enough, on this same site in 2016 about this penciler, and at the end of that article it mentions that if he was alive, he'll be 93, and that was in 2016. So it's even less likely he's alive now. But they didn't know anything either, because nobody had heard from him. So, and that happens sometimes. Sometimes you just get older, you go and do your own things. You're not active anymore in the field you were. And so that happens.
Yeah, and on that happy note, we go into the plot of this one. The second Doctor, hiding on Earth from the Time Lords after being exiled, investigates the claims of mysterious walking scarecrows, only to discover a mystery deeper's tale.
And so this one, as you can tell from what we were saying before, goes back to the very well-loved and very needed theory of Season 6B. And see, this is the type of stuff that if you're just a casual watcher, you might not even notice. But once you get deep into Doctor Who, you find things like this. And this is one of those things that I certainly did think about first time I saw the War Games. Granted, I have actually only seen the whole thing once, nevertheless. At the end of the War Games, of course, it looks like the second Doctor is being forcibly regenerated by the Time Lords after his trial, the very first trial, as it were. But other books came along and said, no, he wasn't regenerated right there. And the next time you see him, he's of course one in Carlo, because the Pottery era started Carlo for Doctor Who, and he's played by John Pottery. But there were always some continuity errors between those to things. Also, when you get involved in the multi-doctor stories, such as the 3 Doctors, which we have previously discussed, the 5 Doctors, and the 2 Doctors, which of course was Colin Baker and Patrick Troughton, which I always thought was random. Due to these stories and different continuity issues that popped up, fans theorized for a while that there was something in between the War Games and Spared from Space.
And to be fair, they didn't really have a choice because based on dialogue in the 2 Doctors, they literally had to be.
I mean, I think by the time the 2 Doctors had come out, the theory was popular enough that the writer, who I have to admit I don't know who it is off the top of my head for the 2 Doctors, threw a lot of bones to the fans saying basically, yeah, it's true. Even if there was no other books or anything written, the 2 Doctors alone would probably have to conform it with the way it's written. Of course, as Michael was saying, this story, which was at the end of kind of a story arc in TV comic, because the War Games ended approximately June 1969. Spared from Space didn't air until January 1970. So they had 6 months, but as any good capitalist company wants to do, they didn't want to stop doing Doctor Who comic strips, and they didn't really fancy the idea of throwing the comic strips to be all your Patrick Troughton stories either. I mean, to be fair, the comic strips are always of dubious continuity with the show anyway, but nevertheless, they didn't want to do that at all. So instead, they just fit stories in between the War Games and Spared from Space. The only thing is, this is the 1960s. Even if kids, and let's be honest, there's always going to be mostly kids, had read these comic stories, it's not like they would even care if they had thought about it, who say it with their friends and say, hey, look, something was in between these 2 stories. Because continuity is something that most kids think about. So as early as these stories, if you count them as canon anyway, in your own hard canon, had kind of already conformed the idea of season 6B. It's just that they were unavailable for most people until the internet came along. So nobody really remembered they happened. So that's why all these fan theories popped up later on, especially after the 2 Doctors and 5 Doctors, to explain all of these discrepancies. And one interesting thing about it is that as late as 2005, people were still talking about it because the writer Terrence Dicks, who wrote a lot of classic Who stories, very big name in Doctor Who, wrote 2 novels in the BBC Past Doctor Adventure series, specifically revolving season 6B, and those would be Players in 1999 and World Game in 2005. And World Game was supposedly the first adventure the Doctor had after the War Games, where he was sent on a mission by the Celestial Intelligence Agency, the CIA, and he was to do clandestine missions for the Time Lords, as he says in the 2 Doctors, officially, quite unofficially, which I always thought was a great Troughton line.
And I think what somewhat relates to this, not necessarily specifically to the whole of season 6B thing, which, like I said, the 2 Doctors pretty much conforms. Like, people can say it's a theory, but it literally isn't based on 2 Doctors dialogue. But there's a piece of dialogue at the end of the War Games, which people sort of fit in to, I guess, conform this comic strip continuity. So just to give a little bit of dialogue from the end of the War Games, this is after the quote-unquote trial. I mean, it's not like the Time Lords are going to let the Doctor go.
I mean, they didn't punish him nearly as hardly as they could have.
Yeah, well, this is a Time Lord speaking to the Doctor. You will be sent to Earth in the 20th century and will remain there for as long as we deem proper. And for that period, the secret of the TARDIS will be taken from you. Which, on a side note, I was sort of strange, but this is early in Time Lord lore. And then the Doctor says, but you can't condemn me to exile on one primitive planet in 1 century in time. Besides, I'm known on Earth. It might be very awkward for me. And that line where he says, I'm known on Earth, well, this is sort of amusing to me.
Yeah, they kind of retcon this into meaning something more than it was meant at the time, don't they?
Yeah. In an earlier TV comic story titled Martha the Mechanical Housemaid, which, as you can imagine, it sounds straight out of the Jetsons or something. But Martha the Mechanical Housemaid, I've not read the story, but I know the gist is that the Doctor creates a mechanical housemaid named Martha, and I believe it's the robot, and the robot is like a mass production type thing. it's taken over by another alien species. But point being that the Doctor creates a, I guess, brand name house-made robot thing that a lot of people buy, and he saves people once these robots start going awry. He saves them all, and I mean, he's even on TV and stuff. He just becomes like a sort of a household name. So that was a comic strip. I think it was published there from February to March 1969, and that takes place before the events of the war games. So when the Doctor's saying, "Hey, I'm known on Earth," people sort of fit that story into saying, "Oh, that's why he's well known on Earth." It just amuses me that they take such lengths to sort of fit in these comic strip TV comic stories into the continuity, and honestly it sort of works. Like, it's ridiculous, but it sort of works, and I think it sort of relates to this whole, I guess, season 6B stuff too, because there's always a way you can make a lot of this fit, and it impresses me how they do so.
Yeah, basically, if you want something to fit, they'll be able to make it fit. Now, the TARDIS wiki is a very broad stance on what canon means, and on the whole, when it comes to something like Doctor Who, when it's been published over decades in multiple forms of media, I completely understand the need for a broad opinion of canon, so I'm not even complaining about that. And it's such utter bullshit that the Doctor is referencing this event, but at the same time, as Michael says, it works out. It works out better actually than most of the TV comic stuff does. Because, of course, this John Hungarian. And yes, there was a famous, I think actually award-winning story. There was an 8th Doctor story done in Doctor Who magazine that talks about John Hungarian. And I believe they also came up in some books and explained in some way. But nevertheless, to actually try to fit this into continuity and say, no, it fits perfectly, I just think it's rather hilarious. It's one of those things that's so absurd I actually have to give it props.
Yeah, and the story of this one I think is sort of interesting. Pretty much, the Doctor is invited on what has to be one of the worst game shows. It's a game show called Explain My Mystery. And based on the gist that we see, contestants come on and they have like a mystery. And there are 3 panelists who are told this mystery, and they're given a chance to explain it. Now, we don't know the mechanics of this game. Like, if they can't explain the mystery, I don't know if the guy who has the mystery gets like money or something. It doesn't go into that. It just seems like a somewhat poorly thought out thing of entertainment, but I guess, hey, if it works, it works. But this farmer comes on and says, "Hey, I'm a farmer, there's strange going on." And we should mention that this guy has an accent to him. Naturally, it's a comic strip. But if you're familiar with comics, and I think we've mentioned before maybe, that both James and I are big fans of comic books. So we've read a bunch of comics in our lives. So when they try to throw an accent on a character, it's always sort of fun to see. But this guy has an accent to him, and he's a farmer talking about strange going on his farm, how he sees scarecrows going on nightly walks, almost like the sleepwalking. The most amazing part of the story is that neither the Doctor nor either the other 2 panelists have any possible solution to this mystery.
Yeah, as I was saying to you, Michael, before you started the recording, I can think of 5 without even thinking about it. Maybe the farmer was stoned. Maybe there was this Scooby-Doo plot to force him off of the land, and so people dressed up as scarecrows. I mean, yes, he goes into a little more detail later on in the comic how he actually sees the scarecrows up on the pole, and then there's a ball of light, and then they start walking. And yes, that's a bit more specific. But at the end of the day, that still could have been an acid hallucination. So maybe the Doctor and the other panelists aren't very inventive. But the funny thing is, as Michael was saying earlier, I'm not sure this quote-unquote game show works, because even after the panelists very openly say, "Hey, I have no idea what's going on there," the host of the show just laughs at the guy, and he doesn't seem like he's getting any reward for it. So,
to be fair, he did like pull out a knife or like a sword on the guy, so I sort of get it if he was sort of asked politely to leave.
Like, that's true, he might have been escorted out of the building, but it's not like they called any police on him, because he's just allowed to leave. Even after literally threatening this guy on, might not be live TV, they might be recording it and saving it for later. That's always possible.
Oh, it's actually worth mentioning. It's really worth mentioning, who's to say, but the name of the farmer is Glanlack Hogan, which is that's going on in my lot to have pretty beast name, so...
I mean, if you ever run into a farmer, Glanlack Hogan, ask him about the scarecrows.
So the Doctor, though, is interested in this mystery, and he decides to accompany Glanlack Hogan to his farm for the weekend just to sort of figure out. He's sort of curious, like, hey, why these scarecrows be walking at night, bruh? Because I guess the doctor's bored. He's like outside on Earth. Why not?
Yeah, he apparently at this time is living in a very fancy hotel, which says it's up in this comic strip, but it's showed up in previous ones during this time. And I guess he doesn't get out enough. He just wants to explore the scarecrows.
And he needs some of that country air. The eventual mystery, though, and answers behind the scarecrow is certainly a sight to behold. And it all comes back to, well, I guess the very basis of this whole period of the Doctor's life.
Yeah, because now I don't think it actually had said it as plainly in the previous strips during this era, but according to this strip, the Doctor was exiled to Earth, but before they could force the regeneration on him, he escaped from the Time Lords. And the last 4, 5, maybe 6 strips during this era have been... Now, he doesn't seem to be hiding because he's still appearing on TV, of all places, but he apparently escaped from his forced regeneration. But the Time Lords have caught up with him in the form of walking scarecrows. Michael?
Yeah, so it seems like the Time Lords are giving the scarecrows a life force. And this plan has such audacity to it. The Time Lords are giving these scarecrows a life force to sort of draw the Doctor out because they know the Doctor would be curious about this and would want to investigate.
Which kind of fits in, honestly, with what they learned about him at the trial.
Yeah, it's not like the scarecrows are doing anything dangerous, they're just going on a nightly walk.
True, but they knew the Doctor was around the UK, and if some farmer goes on the TV show and say, hey, Miss Scarecrows are walking, maybe it would attract his interest.
Yeah, so the strip, I mean, like we said, this is just a 3-part comic strip, 2 pages apiece, so it's not like this is an in-depth story. But the Doctor is watching these scarecrows, he sees, hey, they are indeed alive, and then we'll show you the panel here, but they call out Doctor Who.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to note, during these strips, even as late as the 3rd Doctor, I think, even maybe the 4th Doctor's TV comic strips, the Doctor was interchangeably called either the Doctor or Doctor Who as an actual name. And that was even true in the old 60s and 70s Doctor Who annuals that were printed, which had multiple prose stories in them.
But naturally, the Doctor is taken aback by being addressed by name by these mysterious scarecrows. He says, by the powers. And to be fair, he said it once before too, so it's a quality catchphrase, by the powers.
Yeah, it might have been an explanation he had used just in this comic strip in general, because it sounds kind of otherworldly in a way.
Yeah, it certainly sounds different. And well, since the scarecrows under the influence of the Time Lords have caught up with the Doctor, they then decide now is certainly the time to forcibly regenerate him. And that really is sort of why this, I mean, it's sort of an unassuming comic strip, but it's an important thing, and we mentioned this before in the 3 Doctors, because this is the place where we actually see the regeneration happen. Naturally, we didn't see the regeneration at the end of the War Games. I guess it's sort of alluded to, but we don't really see it. And we actually see the regeneration here. Now, we don't see John Pertwee's face, but this is naturally like a very quick prelude to Spear from Space.
Yeah, it's kind of fun because basically these characters are just sucking him with, I guess, a force power. And then as he's being carried away to the TARDIS, which is just here, I suppose the scarecrows brought to here, he calls out to the farmer, the scarecrows will never bother you again. And those are the great last words of the 2nd Doctor. Then these scarecrows dump him off in the TARDIS and leave as the TARDIS starts dematerializing, which of course leads into Spear from Space, which is kind of actually hilarious how it actually works pretty well, because as we've seen in Spear from Space, the TARDIS just materializes in the field and the Doctor tumbles out. I have to admit, I don't remember what clothes he was wearing. Because I have a feeling he probably was in the 2nd Doctor's clothing, but I don't remember.
I actually can't remember either, but it's certainly the thought that counts.
Yeah, either way, it kind of works enough. And as Michael said, this is, I believe, the only place we see the 2nd Doctor actually regenerate. So I think that's so random that they decided to play it off and do that in a TV comic story of all places. But then again, back in these days, they didn't really care about things like continuity on the whole.
I'm not entirely sure Doctor Who's ever necessarily cared about continuity until like the 90s, to be 100% honest.
Well, it depends what you mean by care. I don't think caring means retconning things, but I think that's what Doctor Who does a lot of the time. But it all works out in the end.
As you can imagine, this is pretty easy to place on the Doctor's timeline, but naturally, James, I know you have a spiel before that, so by all means.
Well, yeah, and I'll go through this quickly. As listeners know, the TARDIS Wiki, and by the way, the TARDIS Wiki is a great source. The URL has changed. It's no longer connected to fandom. Make sure you're using the right TARDIS Wiki. That's something I'll probably remind people from now until the end of time, which works for Doctor Who. But the TARDIS Wiki has a personal timeline for each Doctor, including the extensive extended media ranging from the comic books, comic strips, which is something we're finally casting our chips in on this episode, Big Finish and BBC audios, the multiple book ranges, and everything else in between. Doctor Who canon is a jumbled mess and has been forever, so it's just fun to see where this choice for discussion fit into the universe as a whole, as continuity in the narrative timeline has always been of personal interest to me. And as I had said earlier, this one, on the whole, is quite easy to fit because there's only one place it can be. This takes place, of course, after the War Games. And the previous comic strip and TV comic was a story entitled UFO, which was in TV comic issues 929 through 933. And by the way, if you're a fan of comic books, again, this came out weekly starting in 1951. So that's why the comic numbers are so astronomically high, because it's not normal for comics to get that high in numbering. I mean, Detective Comics and Batman didn't hit that until 2020 or so. And that was in October through November 1969. And, of course, the story immediately after this one was Spear from Space, which aired January 1970. So that's probably, I have to say, it's probably one of the easiest things we've ever placed on the timeline. Well, by we, I mean the TARDIS Wiki. Nevertheless, probably one of the easier things.
Yeah, and to be fair, we sort of placed it before anyway, because we have talked about Spear from Space, and we naturally brought this story up then too. So if all of this walking scarecrows and forced regenerations and patterns of melee, that's probably where you remember it from.
And we could always set up a playlist of all of our reviews in order of continuity by Doctor, but that sounds horrendous, and we're most certainly not going to do that, as funny as that would be.
Yeah, so honestly, as far as like actually talking about our feelings through the story, it's always difficult to talk positively or negatively about
such a meager offering.
Well, yeah, not to reiterate too much, but this is just overall a 6-page story, and certainly the artwork's okay. It's sometimes the Doctor looks a bit off. It's an okay offering insofar as artwork's concerned.
I like how they have him wearing this stovepipe hat.
Yeah, I was going to mention
that he had for literally one episode on TV.
The stovepipe hat was quite a popular addition to the Doctor's ensemble. Like James said, it only popped up in the show once. Where was that even?
I don't even know, to be honest. I could look it up, but I'm in a lazy mood.
Yeah. So it popped up once in the show, but it was very popular in like prose and comic strips. Like it popped up all the time there. So you often see in prose and comic book strips from that time period in the late 60s, you see him wearing this really strange looking hat that pops up all the time, and it's such a distinctive look, and I do sort of like that. Just adds to his character.
Well, that's probably why they did it, wanting to make him look distinctive. Two, in the Ava Manson Doctor Who annuals in the 1960s, when it became the second Doctor's time, most of those annuals were comprised of prose stories, so maybe 4 to 8 pages of stories, which look ancient, but they also usually came with pictures, and yeah, in almost all those pictures, the second Doctor has the hat on. So it certainly wasn't just this that like playing with that.
Yeah, and so I sort of like that. I do like the idea of, the night walking scarecrows. It's sort of creepy. I mean, this story doesn't really go out of its way to be like a horror vibe. It's not really what this is. But the idea itself is certainly creepy, and as we know, this isn't the last time the Doctor deals with scarecrows, on my Human Nature Family of Blood fans out there know.
I wonder if scarecrows showed up in the Human Nature novel.
Yeah, actually, that's funny you mentioned. I was just thinking the same thing. I have no idea.
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to say no.
I'll just pack to no as well. If you're unaware, the Human Nature Family of Blood 2-parter, which was in season 3 of the revival, with, of course, David Tennant as the 10th Doctor and Martha, was based on a book. I believe the book was written by Paul Cornell, who also wrote the 2-parter, and the book was Human Nature, and that one starred the 7th Doctor and Bernice Summerfield. It was part of the Voyage in New Adventure series. But yeah, I have a feeling the scarecrows actually did pop up there. Honestly, I've always had a love for walking scarecrows. Really, ever since the book cover of The Scarecrow's Walk at Midnight from Goosebumps, and also the TV, I don't think it was a two-parter, the TV episode that was based on the book as well, from the Goosebumps TV series, which we did grow up watching.
Yeah, all of this is to say, though, it's sort of how to really feel something from such a small toy. It's fun. It's certainly interesting. It's certainly an historical piece of Doctor Who history.
Yeah, and I do think it's fair to say it feels more like Doctor Who on the whole than maybe earlier TV comic strips did, just because the Time Lords are mentioned, the Exile is mentioned. It feels like it actually could fit in, and all of the John and Gillian stuff really doesn't feel like it did.
To be fair, we have at least, let me first, I haven't read any of the earlier comic strip stuff. Like, I'm vaguely aware of it, but I've not actually read any full story, so I'm not quite sure. I'm going to assume it doesn't feel like that too, but I just can't actually say that with a certainty.
I mean, I haven't read any full stories either, but John and Gillian automatically make it not feel like it fits in, at least to me. But yeah, my thoughts are pretty much the same. It's fun. It's 6 pages in 1969 that are in black and white, so I don't know how much value you'll get from them. But it is cool to see the first, and I suppose last, on-screen regeneration of the Doctor, the second Doctor anyway, and it fits in enough. So I don't know as much about the Doctor being a hideous looking. They call it a game, so I think it really is more like a talk show. Because I don't know what the game was, but I don't know. It's interesting stuff, and I always appreciate Walking Scarecrow, so it gets points for that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'm not sure what more you can say about it. And on a side note, we probably should have mentioned this earlier, but on a side note, you can find most, if not all of these comic strips online. Like, I think there's even, I forget if it's WordPress, but there's some online source that does collect like first and second and third Doctor comic strips. So if you're interested and curious about this sort of more obscure piece of like Doctor Who history, you can find this stuff, you can read them. One thing that's particularly interesting to me as a big comic book guy, I sort of like seeing the different art styles and the different way they go as stories. And like I said, at least I've only read this story in whole, but just looking through some of the other comic strip collections, like in the third Doctor, you can certainly see almost an advancement of how they do it. Like, you can tell, like, the 70s comic strips, they look fresher than what you saw in the late 60s. And it's sort of like seeing that. Like I said, you can find most of the stuff online, and it really is an interesting piece of Doctor Who history.
Yeah, I have no idea if BBC has ever. I don't even know they would have the rights to publish these, honestly. TV Comic eventually, of course, stopped in the 80s. So I don't even know if that company or parent company is still around. So I don't even know if these could ever be commercially released anymore. I mean, I don't know if it's quote unquote piracy, but they are all online. I would invite anybody interested to go take a look for them. I believe, like Michael said, the first 4 Doctors and TV Comics stopped at the 4th Doctor are all on one single WordPress divided by Doctor. So it's a very easy way to just go and take a look at them. I'm not saying you'll find the best written stories there, but I think it's really interesting as well to see the evolution from 1965 to how they ended in the mid to late 70s, especially when they started throwing Carlo into some of their holiday annuals. They actually started not only throwing Carlo into the Doctor Who stories, but also having basically the story be a 2-page, almost splash page. And it actually, some of those look really cool to me. Just outwise.
Yeah, and naturally, we'll be talking about other comic strips along in the future. Just another random thing to throw in. Like you mentioned at the very beginning of all of this, there's so much Doctor Who media out there. It spans such a wide variety of things. There's so many different things to possibly talk about. So, I mean, someone who's watched the show maybe even since the 80s or 70s, they may not be necessarily aware. In fact, they may be aware of comic strips just because of Doctor Who and the Star Beast, which was, of course, made into the Star Beast recently. So they're probably aware of the comic strips, but there's just so much history out there, and I thought it might be fun to throw something else really sort of random in here, just to spice things up a bit.
Yeah, at the end of the day, as much as we love the classic series, and of course the Reviver series that brought everything back to fruition, there's so much more than that. And as nice as Big Finish is, which is something we've only, I'm going to say recently, because even though it's been a year, we've still only listened to around 11 12 stories, sadly, just because of the way that we're doing this. that there's just so much more. There's even Doctor Who magazine alone has tons of comic stories. It has small prose stories from multiple different doctors. And of course, I forget which company it was, but there were the comic books for the 10th Doctor, the 11th Doctor, the 12th Doctor. I think the 13th Doctor had some. The 9th Doctor, I don't remember if it was IDW, but they had monthly comic books. Maybe the 13th Doctor was it for 3 years, but most of the rest of them were for around 3 or 4 years in time span. So that's also maybe even 5 years. So that's also just a lot of comic content right there. And those are whole 22-page stories, probably multiple parts as well. So there's just so much out there. And that's, of course, not even touching on all the Doctor Who books and other series contained within. It's insane if you think about the full scope of what the Doctor Who universe entails. And this is a very small, very early on, but quite interesting, at least to me, part of that universe.
Yeah, so if you have any comments, like I said, I'm not sure how much it is to say about this, aside from the fact that it's an interesting piece of history. But if you have any comments about the Nightwalkers, so I guess how even questions, which we probably could answer, but hey, we always try. You can always reach out to us, either leave a comment here on YouTube or maybe follow us on Twitter. You can follow us at Brothers Mahoney. Yeah, it's just an interesting addition. But with all of that said, what do we have, James, coming up next?
By the powers, up next, we have a story starring Christopher Eccleston as the 9th Doctor, with Rose, Captain Jack, and the return of Mickey. The 11th episode of Series 1 of the revival, Boomtown, that also has another face in it, returning from earlier on in the season. And this episode's always had a bit of a different feel, but I feel like that's true for some of the episodes in this season. And it seems very low-key, but it has a lot of good emotional parts that maybe make up for the, I would say, lack of forward momentum involving almost any actual story.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think it's going to be an exciting episode to talk about. So indeed, catch us next time, and we hope that all of you have a placid day. As always, this has been Michael.
And I have been James.
You've been enjoying the Brothers Mahoney. Until next time.